Peace, everyone, and welcome back. Today, we are continuing our exploration of the calibration problem with Part 2b, how prior calibration governs our reasoning. If you haven't watched Parts 1 and 2a, I'd encourage you to begin there. In the last video, we established how calibration governs coherence and correspondence. Humans reason based on how they are calibrated. Their observations become facts based on what they have been programmed themselves to prioritize. Their reality is filtered through that calibration. I also showed how truth lies not in the parts but in the whole and why system thinking needs to be invoked to understand reality fully. Providing various analogies such as the Plato's allegory of the cave, the movie The Truman Show, and the Quran itself, I explained how we need sound calibration to detect false or distorted representations of reality. Today, we advance the argument forward to contrast various types of anthropocentric calibration schemes and explain why they don't track truth. I look at how utilitarian calibration fares intergenerationally and what does that tell us about reality on the time axis. That is the question we'll explore throughout Part 2b as we examine with the help of two case studies how a superior calibration can anticipate reality before it has had a chance to fully reveal itself. Every human being is calibrated. There is no neutral observer. There is no worldview without a governing standard. The only real question is, what are we calibrated to optimize? On the left is a calibration anchored in a transcendent moral order. Its concern is not simply achieving desirable outcomes, but discerning the rightness of action. Within that framework, truth governs action, and long term flourishing follows as its consequence. On the right, the calibration shifts. The governing question is no longer what is right, it becomes what works, or perhaps what minimizes suffering, or what feels most compassionate. The goal is no longer moral truth, but the optimization of comfort, survival, or immediate benefit. At first glance, those objectives can appear humane. But notice the subtle shift. Compassion has quietly moved from being a moral virtue to becoming the criterion by which truth itself is judged. Yet compassion cannot answer the prior moral question. Compassion toward whom? The victim? The offender? The family? Future generations? Every moral decision benefits someone while imposing costs on someone else. Compassion alone cannot determine whose interests ought to prevail. It requires a prior calibration of what is right. Without that governing standard, problems do not disappear, they simply relocate. Short term comfort is often purchased at the expense of long term consequences. And that is precisely where the Quran adds a deeper insight. Reality eventually reveals whether the standard by which we calibrated ourselves was true. Up to this point, we have established that every worldview is calibrated toward a particular standard. But reality introduces another complication. The consequences of our choices rarely appear immediately. Reality unfolds across time. This creates what I call the temporal buffer or temporal lag, a period in which a system can appear to be succeeding even though its governing principles are already drifting away from reality. That delay matters. If consequences arrive instantly, poor calibration would be obvious. Instead, miscalibrated systems often enjoy long periods of apparent success. Economic growth, consumer comfort, technological advancement. social stability. From within the system, everything appears to confirm that the calibration is correct. But appearances can be deceptive. A system can consume tomorrow's resources to create today's prosperity. It can shift burdens onto future generations. It can violate the architecture of reality while the consequences remain hidden. This is why short horizon optimization is so dangerous. It mistakes delayed consequences for non existent consequences. In other words, because reality has not yet responded, we assume reality has approved. But reality doesn't negotiate, it simply keeps unfolding. Eventually, the buffer disappears, the accumulated costs surface, the apparent success gives way to structural instability. And the very principles that once appeared beneficial begin producing consequences no one anticipated. This temporal dimension is the missing piece. A worldview must not only explain the present, it must correctly anticipate where its governing principles will lead over time. And that brings us to two case studies. One concerns human capital, the other concerns financial capital. At first glance, they seem unrelated, but both reveal the same architecture. Both optimize the present, both defer the cost, and both demonstrate why a superior calibration is one that correctly anticipates reality before reality has finished revealing itself. Let's now test the principle we just established against a real world example. The question is whether a human centered utilitarian governing principle remains aligned with reality after all of its consequences have unfolded. Let's begin on the left. A society increasingly optimizes for individual autonomy, career advancement, personal fulfillment, and immediate freedom. Within that framework, children gradually become viewed less as a civilizational responsibility and more as an optional lifestyle choice. In the short term, everything appears to improve. Individuals enjoy greater freedom. Living standards remain high. Nothing appears broken. Then the temporal buffer begins. The consequences have already been set in motion, but they have not yet arrived. Years later, the demographic reality emerges. Birth rates fall below replacement. The population ages. The workforce shrinks while the number of dependents grows. Labor shortages begin to appear. Rather than questioning the governing principle, the system introduces another optimization. Immigration becomes an economic patch to relieve the immediate pressure. Now, a second complication appears. The same societies importing labor are simultaneously investing in artificial intelligence to replace labor. The proposed solution begins colliding with itself. Eventually, the long term consequences become unmistakable. An aging population, economic strain, social fragmentation, and value incoherence. The divisiveness creates conditions for power to consolidate itself further. Notice the original calibration wasn't disproved immediately. Reality simply took decades to reveal its consequences. That is the lesson. A truth tracking worldview must evaluate principles not only by the benefits they produce today, but by the reality they create tomorrow. Our second case study follows exactly the same temporal architecture. Only this time, the resource being consumed is not human capital, it is financial capital. Let's begin again on the left. A society naturally wants to care for its most vulnerable. It wants to reduce suffering, provide health care, support families, and protect those in need. Those are worthy objectives. The question is not whether compassion is good. The question is how that compassion is financed. Rather than funding these commitments from present production, the state increasingly borrows to sustain promises that current revenues cannot support. At first, everything appears to work. Public services expand, benefits increase, the economy continues growing. Once again, we enter the temporal buffer. Debt quietly accumulates while prosperity appears to continue. Because the consequences are delayed, the system appears to validate itself. But nothing has disappeared. The cost has simply been transferred. When a government borrows, it is ultimately pledging the future productive capacity of its citizens. In effect, tomorrow's labor finances today's compassion. Eventually, however, the buffer expires. Interest payments grow. Debt crowds out productive investment. Governments borrow simply to maintain existing commitments. And what once appeared sustainable begins to fracture under its own weight. Notice what happened. Just like the previous case study, the governing principle wasn't disproved immediately. Reality simply took time to reveal its consequences. That is the lesson. Compassion without a sustainable calibration does not eliminate the cost, it transfers the cost. A truth tracking worldview must therefore ask not only whether a principle produces immediate benefits, but whether it remains aligned with reality across the full timeline of its consequences. We have now reached the point where the pattern should be unmistakable. These were never two separate case studies. They were two expressions of the same calibration. In the first, society borrowed human capital from the future. In the second, it borrowed financial capital from the future. Different resources, the same architecture. Optimize for the present, borrow from tomorrow. Enjoy a period of apparent success, mistake delayed consequences for validation. Then, eventually, reality presents the bill. The temporal buffer never removes consequences, it only postpones them. That is why these problems converge. An aging population shrinks the productive base just as sovereign debt continues to grow. Healthcare systems come under increasing strain. Families weaken. Communities become more fragmented. Every major institution begins to feel the pressure at the same time. This brings us to the final stage. Medical assistance in dying, or MAID, is not a third case study. It is the terminal expression of the same calibration. When a civilization can no longer sustain the lives it was built to protect, the final solution becomes an exit rather than a recovery. That is the tragic irony. The individualist says, "Who cares?" Eventually, the insolvent system replies, "We don't care either." Reality always catches up, not because reality is punitive, but because reality provides cosmic balance. It cannot indefinitely sustain principles that violate its own architecture. And that leads us to the central lesson of part 2. A superior calibration is one that correctly anticipates reality before reality has finished revealing itself. Wisdom is not explaining reality after history has rendered its verdict. Wisdom is choosing the governing principles today that will still correspond with reality tomorrow. This brings us to the end of part 2. In part 3, we'll turn to the Quran itself as providing a superior worldview. We'll see that the calibration problem never disappears. It profoundly influences worldviews where a modern narrative tuned calibration can systematically blind its followers to the unyielding constraints of reality. By allowing the Quran to calibrate us as opposed to taking a lifetime to figure out how reality unfolds over time, we develop the discernment criterion whereby competing claims about reality are anticipated and recursively evaluated. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.